Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. If you're new here, my name is Ivana Harinkyu, and if you are coming back, thank you so much for coming back. Today is Monday, August the 9th, and as we know, schools have really been in that back-to-school mode for the last week or so, and even more schools are starting this week. Now, we had a few start last week, which I know so many of us said, oh, this is so early, but this week we have a lot more going back in the next several weeks as well. So today I am joined by Alabama Education Lab reporter Savannah Trians-Fernandez. Savannah is here to kind of explain to us about this new toolkit released by the Alabama Department of Public Health. Now, we're going to say toolkit and back to school guidance. We're kind of saying those interchangeably, but these are basically just some guidelines that the ADPH released for parents who are sending their kids back to school and what they should expect and what maybe they should be doing. These are not binding by any means, and these are not required by schools. So we'll just start out with that. But Savannah, we're going to link your story here in a little bit once we get off air. But why don't you just start off by telling us exactly what is included in this ADPH back to school guidelines?
Sure. So these guidelines really reflect the CDC guidelines pretty much exactly. So they are recommending universal masking regardless of vaccination status, social distancing, 3 feet if everybody is masked, 6 feet if not. Hand washing, sanitation, cleaning surfaces once a day, increased ventilation, a lot of the same things we saw last year.
So I know that last year the difference was so many different schools had virtual options. So going back to school, are schools really just going back totally in person with all of these different guidelines in place, or are schools still offering that virtual option for those who don't feel comfortable sending their kids back in this environment?
Yeah, great question. So, the focus is really on in-person learning, and that's what schools want. That's what the CDC is recommending. That's what people think is best for kids, for their mental health, for their learning. But there are districts that are offering virtual learning still. So we are going through making a list district by district, since each district has the ability to determine for themselves what their back to school plans are going to look like. So as of now, we've listed that there are about 25 districts that have virtual options available for all grades. There are about 25 districts that have no virtual options, and the rest are mostly for middle schoolers and high schoolers.
That's interesting. Now, and we're going to go back to that in a minute, but let's go back to some of these guidelines. Now, again, I just want to keep repeating, these are not binding. This is not a law. These are guidelines from the Alabama Department of Public Health. But you said that a lot of these guidelines really followed CDC recommendations. So let's start off with masking. We know that, again, ADPH has recommended universal masking in schools. So tell us, Savannah, what exactly does universal masking mean? Does that mean you wear, or the kids rather, would wear masks on the playground? What is being done in lunchrooms? What is being done for PE and things like that?
Yeah, so universal masking for indoor settings is what is being focused on. So if you're outside, you don't have to wear a mask. Lunch is something we've heard a lot about from parents who are concerned that their kids don't have to wear a mask during lunch because, you're eating. It's not really a feasible option. But as of now, it's looking like lunch isn't going to be masked. But parents are saying that they are going to come, pick their kids up from school and have them eat in their car. There are some ways to be flexible there. PE also not required to be masked. So mostly indoor settings, except for lunch. Outdoor doesn't have to be masked.
That's interesting, especially what you say. You've heard from some parents who maybe would pick their child up for lunch and eat in the car. That's interesting because we know that's not an option for a lot of parents who maybe are working and can't get away from work to do that. Maybe their lunch times don't line up, or maybe a parent doesn't even get a lunch break. So that's an interesting comment there, Savannah. But so we talked a little bit about masks. I know that's a hot topic for a lot of people, but that is something recommended by ADPH. So how many districts do we know of that are requiring masking in schools?
Yeah, so from the last time we talked, there's been a huge uptick in districts that are requiring it at this point. So right now there's about a third of districts, which is around 50 districts in the state. And at the beginning of the month, that number was only 4. So a lot more districts, because of this surge in cases and because of everything that's happening with the Delta variant, have gone back and said, okay, we're going to be requiring masks at this point. Some saying only for 30 days, some saying, for the foreseeable future.
That's interesting that you make that point. There were 4 last time we talked, and now it's about one in 3 school districts there requiring those masks. I'm looking through comments here. I know they're coming in really quickly, but I did want to quickly answer one. I think it was from Ed talking about children in hospitals in Alabama. We had a story this weekend. I will link it when we are finished here, but it talked about how the state had passed 2,000 COVID hospitalizations, including 28 pediatric cases. So 28 kids hospitalized with COVID-19 as of this weekend, Ed. Just saw that question and wanted to quickly answer that. But I know we talk about masking, Savannah, there have been people on each side of the issue who are very unhappy with what their district is doing. So we know, or at least I know, I've heard from a lot of parents who have been writing to their school board, who have been calling their school board. Do we know if the feedback from parents is really what made a lot of these schools change their minds?
So yes and no. I think that there are a lot of parents who are pushing this and saying we want people to wear masks, and those parents have ADPH on their side, and I think ADPH recommendations are really what's pushing that. But in terms of school districts that are hearing from parents that don't want masks, that's also a very influential group of parents. Who, like for Hoover, an example, Hoover, instead of saying we're going to require masks for the foreseeable future, had a lot of parents pushing back against it. And so they said, okay, we're just going to require it for 30 days and go from there.
That's so interesting to me, that this 30-day situation. We know, and we know this from on Friday, Dr. Scott Harris of ADPH, state health officer, did have a press conference where he talked about vaccinations. And while he encouraged people to get vaccinated, he said there's a 6 to 8 week time frame from when you get vaccinated to when you are fully protected. He also talked about this Delta wave and about kind of the timeline on that is not expected to be over in 30 days. So that's interesting. Savannah, do you know why that 30-day time frame for some of these mask requirements was implemented, or why specifically 30 days?
No, we don't. And that's something that we've been hearing from parents too, who are saying, you know, what does 30 days mean? And once 30 days hits, what are you going to be using to reevaluate? So that's not really clear to us at this point, and it's been a bit controversial.
And I'm sure, again, we've got people in our comments giving us their thoughts on every side. I'm going to look through these when I can. But let's take a step past masks for a minute and let's talk about vaccinations. Now, we know right now that vaccinations, we have 3 approved under emergency use here in America. We've got Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Moderna, and we have one of those that is approved for teenagers. So that is 12 and up. So I guess kind of at the preteen, right? 12 and above there. So we have several students in a middle school, I guess in an 8th grade setting especially, and then through high school that are eligible to be vaccinated if they choose to be. So Savannah, what do we know about high schools in that kind of tail end of middle school about vaccines? Now, either requirements there, recommendations, anything like that?
Yeah, so ADPH is urging everyone who is eligible to be vaccinated to get vaccinated as soon as possible. Right now in Alabama, for people 12 and up, between 12 and 18, the vaccination rate, it's about 4%, 7% for people who have had their first dose. So that's being really heavily urged. But in terms of requirements, it's not legal to require the COVID vaccination in Alabama, so schools aren't requiring it. They're just saying, you know, if you can do it, do it.
But that does not affect the other vaccines that are required to enroll in public schools. Is that correct?
Correct. And because of COVID, there's been a drastic decrease in the number of people who have gotten their regularly required vaccines. But those are still legally required. That's
very interesting. I'd love to do a deep dive on that one later, but this topic's too big to branch off on that right now. So we'll come back to that. Let's go into social distancing. Now, I don't have children, but I've been around small kids enough to know that trying to implement a social distancing limit must be very difficult, especially for those kind of kindergartners up through that middle elementary school age. So what is being done about social distancing, especially for those elementary schools?
Yeah, so I think this is also where masks come into play, because it is social distancing of 3 feet if everybody's masked, and if not, 6 feet. So it is a matter of, you know, spreading out desks, and it is, like you said, hard to enforce. But if everybody's wearing a mask, the risk of transmission becomes a lot lower. So I think that that's what's being really heavily relied on. But 3 feet in indoor settings, if everybody's masked, 6 feet if not.
And I have a question on that, Savannah, but again, looking through comments here, I have Angelita. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. She says, is Alabama shutting down again in September, or is that a rumor? Angelita, we have no confirmation of anything like that. We do know, actually, to the contrary, that Alabama Governor Kay Ivey has said she will not be closing any type of or creating a mask mandate for the state. She said pretty strongly that was not going to happen. She also said that there would be no other restrictions like last year. She said pretty heavily against using that word shutdown. She said that she was going to keep the state open. She has repeatedly said Alabama is open for business. So no, there are no statewide restrictions in place as of right now. There are also no statewide restrictions expected in the near future. So just wanted to quash that rumor right there. But Savannah, let's get back to that social distancing, that 3 feet kind of rule you said a minute ago. So whose job is it to enforce that 3 feet social distancing rule? And I can imagine, at least when I was in school, you have it maybe 20 to 28 kids in a classroom with maybe one teacher, maybe a teacher's aide. So that's 2 adults in a classroom with all of these students. How do you enforce 3 feet between all of these kids?
Yeah, so I think ideally, their desks would be spaced by that amount. But other than that, yeah, it is, like you said, really up to, especially for younger kids, really up to the teachers to kind of enforce that and make sure that's being done in classrooms to whatever ability they have.
Summer, no, there is no mask mandate for Alabama schools. I'll repeat it, there is no mask mandate statewide. There's also no mask mandate for schools. On the other hand, the Alabama Department of Public Health is recommending students in schools wear masks when they are inside. That's what they're calling universal masking. So there are recommendations. There are no requirements statewide. Taking a step further, there are requirements based on different school districts. So in Alabama, school districts can kind of decide what they want to do for their district. It's really based on a local level. So Savannah, I'll let you repeat for maybe some people who join late, like Summer, how many schools are requiring masks?
About 1/3 of districts at this point.
So about 1/3 of districts. So if you have a child who is about to go back to school, I would recommend checking with your local district. Also, Savannah, I think you said that you and your colleagues at the Alabama Education Lab are working on a list for that as well.
Yeah, so there's a list we have on our website right now that says, here are the reopening plans, whether or not they are requiring a mask. And then this week we'll have a list out about virtual options.
So we will leave the link here as well for the mask list that Savannah is mentioning. We'll put it here when we are finished off air. I'll find it and link it. We also, again, we will have later this week that virtual options story Savannah mentioned. I have a bunch of people saying they don't have a virtual option in their district and they would love to have one. And Savannah, real quick, if you want to give, just kind of say your email address if people who have that feeling want to explain that. Savannah works with our Alabama Education Lab, and I'm sure would be happy to hear your thoughts. So Savannah, give your email for those people.
Yes, so I have a complicated last name, but it's S. Tryens Fernandez, as you'll see on the banner here, how it's spelled. So STRYENS-FERNANDES at AL.com.
So it's just S and then use the last name right there at AL.com. So let's take one more step here, Savannah, into more of these guidelines from the Alabama Department of Public Health. Again, they are guidelines. Yeah. Quarantining. We saw last year in the school year of 2020, when kids did go back to school, when there were cases, there were strict quarantine rules, but also kind of varying. And it changed a lot. It was kind of hard to keep up with who needed to quarantine when, for how long. So what is the quarantine guidelines for kids, either who test positive or maybe have somebody in their family who tests positive for COVID-19?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't think this year's rules are going to be any simpler. So I will try and go through this point by point because they're also a little bit complicated. But so if you have tested positive for COVID, you have to quarantine for 10 days. Now but if you are vaccinated and asymptomatic, you don't need to quarantine. If you are asymptomatic and you've had COVID and fought it in the last 3 months, then you don't need to quarantine. If you have been in close contact with someone who's been infected, and close contact means within 6 feet for 15 minutes or more, you'll have to quarantine unless both parties are wearing masks. So, I mean, it's a bit simple to say vaccinated students and staff don't need to quarantine, but a real emphasis here on whether or not you're showing symptoms.
That's a mouthful. Savannah, we will have to we'll put those in the comments. We might actually make a kind of a graphic later with all of that information so that you can have that handy if you need it. Again, looking at some of these questions, I have one asking about when will shots be ready for kids a little bit younger. We have not heard any sort of timeline on that. We know experts have said that they hope that to be maybe by the end of the year, but there is no timeline that has been released on shots for kids younger than 12. So we'll reiterate that. We also will reiterate that these vaccines, people asking if they are approved under emergency use by the FDA. They have that full FDA approval, as a lot of people have been referring to it, is expected again in the next couple of weeks. So Savannah, this is obviously something that so many people are affected by, this ADPH guidance and just back to school in general. Whether you are a student, maybe a high school student or a middle school student, and you are trying to make your own decisions or kind of form your own thoughts going back to school, or you have a parent of a young child sending them back to school, there are so many people who are interested in this conversation. So I know you said that virtual school story is going to come up later this week. You have the stories on 1 in 3 districts requiring masks, but let me ask you, do you expect these guidelines or do you expect these rules in school districts to change anytime soon? Or are these set and they're set for the year?
Schools are changing their guidelines constantly. We're still seeing it happen, even at schools that have gone back to school, saying, let's put in a virtual option now, even after classes have started. So I think that school districts are really just following case numbers, hospitalizations, what's happening with COVID, and making their decisions from there. But constantly be checking and constantly be looking for communication from your district, because it seems that this is just going to be a continuing process with a lot of evolutions.
Have you heard anything from whether it be the state, from the ADPH or the State Board of Education as to say a threshold when they would have to make a decision about schools going back to all virtual? Or has that even been a discussion at this point?
Not a discussion that we know of. They've been really just happening at the local level. So it's really just school districts making these decisions with whatever information they are taking in.
Do you know how many schools are going back in Alabama this week, Savannah?
The vast majority of school districts. We had about 24 go back last week, and all but 4 or 5 going back this week.
So I know it's going to be a busy week for you and your colleagues, Savannah, at the Education Lab. Again, we will leave the links to those stories that we've been talking about in this comment thread. And Savannah, I know you will be following up on this for the next several weeks. And I think, unfortunately, you're going to have your hands full there again with a lot of these guidelines changing. Now, again, I will just reiterate what you said a little bit ago, is that in the last maybe 2 weeks, we have seen a dramatic increase in the amount of districts who have changed their rules, especially on universal masking. So I know that you will be following that for us at the Education Lab.
Yeah.
Everybody, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your questions. I will remind you again, if you have specific education questions, concerns, feel free to email Savannah. We'll leave her email address here in the comments. If you have questions about vaccines in general, you can email the AL.com email address. It's vaccines, VACCINES. So add that S on the end, at AL.com, and we will get a professional to answer your question, and we will get that answer on our website. So if you need all of that information, again, we'll leave it here in the comments. But Savannah, thank you so much for all of your knowledge. Good luck with this back to school week. And everybody watching, thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.